Is our great privilege today to welcome Senator Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, who has been on the COVID controversies from the outset. He's got some very interesting insight because he was there and questioning things. And as many of us were, there was a lot of head shaking going on, as those of you who listen to these threads on a regular basis are well aware. And we're going to sort of talk about his experience pushing back and trying to understand what happened to us. Again, Senator Ron Johnson is from Wisconsin. He was chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee from 2015 to 2021, and now ranking member for the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Speaking of investigations, we will do just that after this.
Our laws, as it pertains to substances, are draconian and bizarre. The psychopaths start this way.
He was an alcoholic because of social media and pornography, PTSD, love addiction,
Fentanyl and heroin. Ridiculous.
I'm a doctor, for Christ's sake. Where the hell do you think I learned that?
I'm just saying, you go to treatment before you kill people.
I am a clinician. I observe things about these chemicals.
Let's just deal with what's real.
We used to get these calls on Loveline all the time.
Educate adolescents and to prevent and to treat.
If you have trouble you can't stop and you want to help stop it, I can help. I got a lot to say. I got a lot more to say.
Welcome, everybody. Just a review of the schedule a bit going forward. Naomi Wolf tomorrow. I think that is at our usual time at 3 o'clock. And you will watch me fall on my sword before Dr. Wolf. And I cannot, I have to humble myself because I was very dismissive of some of the things she said last time that are of great concern to me now. And that is on me, not on her, obviously. And then on Friday, we will be speaking to somebody from Great Britain who's been working very hard. That'll be at 11 a.m. on some of the issues pertinent to children.
Pacific.
11 a.m. Pacific, I beg your pardon. And keep in mind, Dave Rubin on February 13th, Monday, early noon. And then Jessica Rose at our usual time on February 15th, and Brooke Jackson on February 22nd.
Duncan Trussell on Tuesday, Valentine's Day.
Susan, his book, Duncan Trussell
Your
on Valentine's
lover.
Day. We are going to be at an undisclosed location, and I'm not quite sure how that's all going to work out, but we're looking very forward to that, of course.
You're afraid to advertise it?
Well, I mean, okay, I can tell you we will be at the Your Mom's House studios, but I don't know. Susan has predicted we'll be in a different room than we're planning to be in, so we'll see how that plays out. So it's at this point indeterminate.
Have an Ethernet cord.
Exactly. So I'm looking so forward to today's conversation. So let's get right to it. Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. Senator Johnson, welcome to the program.
Well, Dr. Drew, thanks for having me on.
It's really our privilege. And before the mics heated up, you were starting to tell me about what was happening when physicians, highly trained, top of their career, highly respected, people funded by the NIH and the NIMH and the CDC, very much involved with research and academia, suddenly were being silenced. That's where you raised your hand and said, why are we doing this?
Well, as chairman of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, I started holding roundtables right off the bat. And I had Scott Gottlieb come in early February. And one of the things we learned from that roundtable is we don't make drugs in this country. Not the key ingredients, the precursor chemicals, the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So that was my first takeaway. But then so obviously I'm watching this very carefully, highly concerned, not knowing what's pulling off. We all were very concerned. But then we started seeing videos popping up, doctors coming off of 12, 14, 16-hour shifts, speaking in the camera, doing their own little webcams, and just describing that this is not what we normally see in terms of pneumonias. There's something else going on here. And, looked at that with a great deal of curiosity. But then I was even more curious about why those doctors were being censored. They were being pulled down off YouTube. There were a couple doctors out of California that were treating patients in the clinic and making claims that, I think a lot more people have had COVID than what we're really talking about. So, okay, well, that's interesting. And, my perspective was, you go back to the 1918 flu pandemic, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the capability of doctors being able to utilize this marvelous technology and, share their experiences and, their theory of the case and practice medicine. My daughter was originally born with transmission of the great arteries. I went through that, and during her surgery, I really came to understand what that term the practice of medicine meant. It wasn't a physical building. It literally was practicing. And that's what we should have been doing during the early stages of the pandemic. We should have practiced medicine. We should have had doctors utilize their skill, their knowledge, their brain power, and share the experience, but that wasn't allowed. And that's where my little spidey senses went up and said, something is really wrong here. What's going on?
Yeah, that was precisely where the rubber hit the road for me as well. I just have never seen anything like that. At first, I thought all my peers have frozen in place. Normally, you go to a physician, as you say, because of their practice, but the practice is fundamentally the application of judgment, not knowledge, not evidence-based. That's all a foregone assumption. But based on evidence and knowledge, our application of judgment for this given individual in this particular situation. Patients were being sent home and told to come back when they're dying. It was the most unbelievable instructions I've ever heard in my life. And doctors were frozen in place, afraid to try things to help patients. To me, that was an alarming reality. It brought to my attention something I did not know at the time, which the majority of physicians are employees. And as employees, they were fearful of losing their job and were getting instructions from on high and were afraid to do anything. So that was my first insight. But I'm wondering what was happening at your end of the operation, so to speak, at that point. Here you are, you're a senator, you're questioning things. Did your peers try to silence you or mistreat you in any way?
No, they pretty well ignored me. But I think the next piece of the puzzle for me was when President Trump, well, first of all, before that, there was I think a state senator in Michigan who was treated with hydroxychloroquine. I know you probably got to put up your warning sign, but
yeah,
and
we do.
It seemed promising, right? And President Trump mentioned it. And so from my standpoint, isn't it true with just about I think every disease, isn't the general approach is early treatment? First of all, early diagnosis,
early treatment, and early diagnosis, early treatment, and then reapplication, novel applications of already approved substances. And my understanding was, we've discovered through talking to people that were in the government making decisions at the time on the health side, that they had something like 85,000 doses ready to go. They'd actually pooled it together and were ready to help distribute this stuff to try to do something, to try to help doctors do something. At very minimum, they would have at least seen their patients again. You know what I mean? They would have at least not seen them when they were blue. They would have seen them and followed them and helped them. Maybe they would have tried steroids or all these other things we were learning about at the time.
Well, first of all, there was a very legitimate fear on the part of healthcare providers, and God bless them. I mean, that's why we were celebrating all the nurses and doctors who had the courage and compassion to treat patients. Not all of them did. But anyway, going back to, so I heard the possibility of early treatment. I'd never heard of it. It took me a couple of weeks just to learn how to pronounce hydroxychloroquine.
Right.
And so what we'd actually done is Novartis had donated something like 30 million doses into the national stockpile. And so there was a log jam there. They weren't being distributed. And so from my standpoint, early treatment made all the sense in the world. And I've always been completely agnostic. I don't care if it's hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, budesonide. I mean, I'm probably not even pronounces those things correctly. But there literally was there was a number of drugs that could have been used for early treatment, off-label as well as on-label. And so early on, we were mainly talking about hydroxychloroquine, and it wasn't being distributed. And so I literally had the CEO of Novartis. I was texting him back and forth. They were kind of excited about it. They were telling me had something like a dozen trials. And my conversations with him went on from, I think, about mid-March to about mid-April, and then they just ceased. It just went radio silence. And I'm going, what's going on here? So we originally had what I would call the logjam in the distribution channel, but then we end up with what I would call the prescription logjam. Rick Bright, who was working at BARDA, was asked to do an investigational drug protocol through the NIH to make hydroxychloroquine available to doctors. He didn't want to. And so he went to a buddy at the FDA and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to issue an emergency use authorization. Sounds good, right? But they made it so restrictive, they restricted it to in hospitals for trials. which
Yeah,
basically
yeah.
made it unavailable to the wider medical community. And so he knew
And
exactly what he's
useless
doing. So
too.
he sabotaged the
Yeah.
use of hydroxychloroquine. And again, it didn't make any sense to me. I mean, I'm a senator. When we go on trips, I know colleagues have gone to Africa. They just get prescribed hydroxychloroquine. They don't do any EKGs or anything on it. So it's widely available. I know people with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis that had hydroxychloroquine. All of a sudden, this is some dangerous drug.
Hmm.
Listen,
Okay.
every drug can have some
So,
problems, but this was a pretty
so
widely
so
prescribed
what
drug. And it
happened?
just it didn't
What
make sense.
happened to us? Now, people flew into hysterics about a drug that they just learned how to pronounce the name of that I've been using for 40 years. But what was happening there? Can we kind of put our finger on what was that? It was the most. Was it just a colossal mass hysteria? Was it a media induced intentional distortion driven from the FDA so they can protect the EUA for an upcoming vaccine? What was going on, do you think?
That's my assumption. My assumption, there was an agenda being driven here, and we've got more and more evidence of prior to the pandemic, these exercises being conducted, people wanting a universal vaccination program, and so at some point in time, the Fauci's of the world decided, no, we're going to end this pandemic with a vaccine. And of course, if you have an effective treatment, it's going to make it very difficult to get an emergency use authorization on an untested vaccine, because those things normally would take years in development and trials to get an approval. And again, if you have an effective treatment, you're not going to get an emergency use authorization. So my assumption is the word went out, and let's face it, Fauci has a lot of power. He is in control of all these grants. And so nobody wanted to buck him. And so all of a sudden it was just decided on vaccine, and no early treatment was going to be considered. And none was. Even though I was holding hearings on it and things looked promising, people weren't considering it.
As it pertains to that, again, this is still a little mysterious to me. I get the evangelism on the part of Birx for her lockdowns and Fauci for his vaccine. But it was such a miscarriage of the basic responsibilities of public health. They could have been educating people. In fact, I've noticed now their sort of messaging and commercials and things are starting to get more sort of educational about how to treat COVID, how to survive COVID. I don't know if you have COVID. I mean, there was nasal sprays that could reduce the risk. There was monoclonal antibodies became available. At no point did they say, hey, everybody, stop panicking. In fact, quite the opposite. They said, panic as though this were a nuclear holocaust, which is what we reserve the term shelter in place for. Pretend this is a nuclear holocaust. You should be just as scared, as opposed to, hey, let us in public health tell you how to deal with this illness effectively as it comes along. That to me was just mind-boggling. Do you have any insight into why that happened?
Well, again, in the political realm, if you can create a state of fear, you can control people. I held my first official hearing in May, and one of the individuals I invited was John Ioannidis, because he had done the analysis of the Princess Cruise. And pretty much the data from that little micro study has held true through the entire pandemic. So I had him along with Scott Atlas. This is the first time I had Pierre Corey testify before us as well. But I really wanted John Ioannidis there because I wanted to point out, I wanted to put things in perspective. This wasn't Ebola, about a 40% death rate. It wasn't MERS at about 30%. It wasn't SARS at about 8 to 10%. This was going to be something like maybe a bad flu season, maybe double bad flu season, a dangerous disease, something to take seriously, but nothing to panic over. Certainly, even in the Princess Cruise, we realized that the vulnerable population was the elderly. Maybe I'm not sure we really had information on other comorbidities at that point in time, but this is a disease to take seriously if you're elderly. But otherwise, if you're young, take precautions. Don't spread it to the elderly. But you probably had a pretty good chance of surviving that. We should have been calming the population down. Instead, we were freaking them out.
1,000%. So I'm going to bring Kelly Victory in here in just a second, and we have lots more to kind of scroll through in terms of the evolution of your experience through all this. But let me jump a little bit ahead of that, and I know Kelly will ask these same questions when she gets in here. But what do we do now? There have been this terrible, terrible miscarriage and overreach and complete disregard for personal liberties. Is there a road ahead? Is there a solution? And people don't trust science or doctors or public health anymore, as well they shouldn't, I suspect. Do you have a road out?
Well, I come from a manufacturing background, so you're solving problems all the time. There's a problem-solving process. And the first step in solving any problem is admitting you have one and then properly diagnosing it. So in this case, we do need to use a medical term, a postmortem on this. We need to analyze what went wrong. We need to expose the truth, uncover it and then expose the truth. And let's face it, the federal health agencies are not being honest. They're not being transparent. One of the biggest impediments we have is nobody wants to admit they're wrong. I would argue the body count is way too high from the mismanagement of this. They can't afford to be proven wrong. And Dr. Drew, our big problem is, we're up against the COVID cartel. The administration, the federal health agencies, big pharma, most people in the mainstream media, the big tech, media social giants or social media giants, they have the power to make it very difficult to be proven wrong. So the first step is we need to expose and uncover the truth, and then we need to move forward.
I've been telling people before we'll go to break in just a second, but that this thing, the COVID situation, followed line and verse with the opioid epidemic. It also followed along some of the psychosurgery excesses. Whenever there's an excess in medicine, whenever there's excesses that physicians perpetrate and then drug companies blow into the sales of those excesses, opioid pandemic being the prime example, you always find a small cohort of evangelical physicians who believe they're off to save the world, and they have a religious fervor rather than a scientific certainty. And it's untoward harm, incredible amounts of harm can get underway with those folks, particularly when they get control of regulatory agencies that oversee the behavior of other physicians who become afraid, paralyzed, and unable to assert any objection. Again, the opioid pandemic, I fought that for a decade and a half, and I know exactly how they do this. I lived it. But Senator, I want to call you doctor. That's a sign of respect, sir. I'm so used to doing that from my physician peers that I look up to and respect. Senator Ron Johnson is here. We're going to take a little break so I can get Dr. Kelly Victory in here. She and Senator Johnson have been talking, and we're going to hear what they've been speaking about and continue to scroll through some of this history to try to make sense of what we've just been through. Again, we'll be right back. Not sure how to say I love you this Valentine's Day? Well, nothing says I love you more than a few minutes of relaxation, and Genucel Skincare does just that. Gives you the luxury gift of feeling like you spent the entire day in the spa, all while, in fact, in the comfort of your own home. Susan loves to feel pampered and special, especially on Valentine's Day, so why not relax with a detoxifying mask and feel amazing after only one use?
I know I'm a snob about the products I use on my face. Everybody knows it. Every time I go to the dermatologist's office, they're just rows and rows of different creams. Retinols, vitamin C cream, under eye cream, night creams.
Scrubs.
And then when I get to the counter, they're overpriced. All kinds of products that you can all find at Genucel.com. I've fallen in love with this product at a fraction of the price. I've been using Genucel for 6 months now, and I'm very impressed.
Genucel's mask works wonders by pulling out all of your imperfections to make you feel refreshed and looking like you just stepped out of a facial appointment. Order the Dr. Drew package today and try this amazing mask for free. That's right, every single Dr. Drew and Susan package includes a free mask to celebrate you and your loved one on this Valentine's Day. Go to Genucel.com/Drew and enter code Drew for an extra 10% off your entire purchase. Plus, all orders are upgraded to priority shipping for free. That's Genucel.com/Drew, GENUCEL.com/DREW. Despite the U.S. blowing through the $31.4 trillion debt ceiling this January, the White House and the government still refuses to reduce spending. When it comes to fiscal responsibility, you can't afford to bury your head in the sand. Now would be a great time to consider gold with Birch Gold. In times of high uncertainty and instability, gold is king. Birch Gold makes it easy to convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in precious metals. Here's what you need to do. Visit birchgold.com/Drew to claim your free information kit, the info kit on gold, and then talk to one of their precious metals specialists. Think about this. To dig our country out of this mountain of debt, every single taxpayer in the country would have to write a check for $247,000, and of course they're not, so it's only getting worse. Protect yourself with gold today by visiting birchgold.com/Drew. That is BIRCH gold.com/Drew. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers, and countless 5-star reviews, you can trust Birch Gold to protect your future. Here's what I want you to do. Visit birchgold.com/Drew today. Some platforms have banned the discussion of controversial topics. If this episode ends here, the rest of the show is available at drdrew.tv.
There's nothing in medicine that doesn't boil down to a risk-benefit calculation. It is the mandate, public health, to consider the impact of any particular mitigation scheme on the entire population. This is uncharted territory, Drew.
It is uncharted territory, and yet here we are. Dr. Kelly Victory, I give you Senator Ron Johnson.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks so much for being here. I truly appreciate your time, particularly after the riveting State of the Union address last night. I'm sure you've got lots of things going on in the Capitol today. I want to step back a little bit from where Drew was going with this in terms of the why and how do we move out of it, and use for the benefit of our viewers sort of a loose timeline of events of how things came onto your radar and the different things that you were doing to try to not just address them, demand answers. Whether or not you got them is another question, but you certainly, more than anyone I know in Washington, and I mean this sincerely, were absolutely a warrior with regard to saying, wait a minute, we need answers. So you and Drew started the conversation, and I agree where it started, it appears for you in February of 2020, within weeks of hearing about this novel virus and this burgeoning pandemic, was with regard to therapeutics. You clearly were aware that there were physicians who were using some novel therapeutics, but you also were aware, as you said and touched on briefly, this critical issue of our vast over-reliance on China for pharmaceuticals. So speak, if you would, just at least briefly about that issue. It's worthy of its own show in and of itself, but the issue of our reliance on China.
Well, my first concern when I heard that there may be a drug like hydroxychloroquine that could work is, will we have enough? That's why I contacted the CEO of Novartis. And you start realizing how many billions of doses that are administered a year, and where they're all produced, and how we could obtain them. And obviously, I was concerned that we would not have enough of them. And I really thought the biggest problem was going to be, how do you allocate them properly? How do you ration them? So that was my biggest concern. Not necessarily that it was going to become controversial, but would we have enough of any medicine if we, actually found some therapeutics? And again, from my standpoint, that was the thing we should have fully concentrated on, was therapeutics. Instead, the people in charge, the Faucis, the Birx of the world, they're all about stopping the spread, which, listen, it made sense, but it wasn't going to happen. And we were not able to do that. But because they were completely focused on stopping the spread, they primarily focused on the test. And of course, CDC kind of screwed that one up to begin with. But then Congress, their solution to every problem is spending money. Well, here was something they could spend money on. They could spend money on the development of the tests and the production of the tests and the distribution of the tests. And so that became the focus initially for the first, 6 or 7 or 8 months until the vaccine became available, was funding and distributing tests. Even though the horse was out of the barn, it was pretty obvious that we were not going to be able to stop the spread. The whole charade about masks is absurd, but it just shows you how misdirected the approach and the response to COVID was.
So my question to you is, I believe it was in August of 2020, we'd gotten through the spring into the summer, and some of us were looking very actively and using very actively some of these therapeutics, things like hydroxychloroquine and steroids at that point. You and I believe it was Senator Mike Lee and Ted Cruz wrote at least one letter to the FDA demanding to know the state of the investigation about early therapeutics. What were they looking at? Where was the data? What kind of response did you get from the powers that be at the FDA?
I never got a response until really the end of December after I held a couple of hearings on early treatment. The first hearing I had where we talked about early treatment was with Pierre Corey in May of 2020, when he came on and talked about his work with Paul Merrick on corticosteroids. Now, he was vilified for, I think, about 8 weeks before the study came out on dexamethasone out of the UK. Then all of a sudden, the use of corticosteroids was okay. But when Pierre Corey testified before me in May, it wasn't blessed by Fauci, so we weren't going to use it. The only thing at that point in time is remdesivir, right?
Right.
Without any kind of valid trial that showed any kind of success, remdesivir actually was recommended against by the WHO because of the miserable failure it had with Ebola trials. But all of a sudden that became the standard of care. Still scratching my head on that one. Not really, because there were so many conflicts of interest with Gilead within the panel that recommended it. But anyway, so remdesivir was fine. That became the standard of care. And you're the doctor. You can talk about the problems that I think exist with remdesivir. But all other options were basically being panned, and they weren't being looked at. So when I finally had a conversation with Francis Collins, it was probably one of the most head-knocking conversations I've had with a federal official. As a United States Senator, it was just frustrating. I was saying, what are you doing? What kind of investigation? He said, well, Senator, I mean, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars through our Active 6 program, investigating all kinds of generic drugs. And I said, okay, send me the data. I want to see what you're spending the money on, what you've investigated. To this day, I've not even gotten a page of data in terms of what the CDC, NIH, FDA were investigating in terms of the use of generic drugs, because I don't think they were investigating them at all. The only thing that's been recommended during COVID by the CDC or the federal health agencies are new, expensive, patentable drugs. Generic drugs need not apply. And I've come to learn that's basically the approach of our federal health agencies who have been captured by big pharma.
So exactly right. So in the spring and summer of 2020, you are advocating for early treatment. You're asking for the data on the investigation on these readily available, inexpensive, FDA-approved, dirt cheap drugs, things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, budesonide, that are pennies a pill, are available over the counter in almost every country other than the United States. Yet instead, they will only give any credence to remdesivir at $3,000 a dose and other new drugs that are still on patent and on brand, and therefore can make somebody a lot of money. So you're writing letter after letter, demanding these things, getting no answers. So we've got that bucket of questions that are going on. Next thing that, from what I can tell, that came on your radar was to really highlight what I call the intrusion of third parties into the decision making. And those third parties included not just big pharma and big tech, but things like the teachers' unions. How the teachers' unions were really leading the discussion and leading decisions with regard to school closures, lockdowns, and those sorts of things. So talk about how you then transition. You didn't get answers to, you didn't have resolution to the early treatment thing. The next thing on your radar, in your focus, was the intrusion of these third parties.
Well, again, the mask mandates made no sense to me. I mean, we heard Fauci early on say, well, masks aren't going to work. You just hear immediately that the virus is a lot smaller than goes right through the masks. The pores are much larger. So why are we pushing masks? And then you find out that the CDC issues guidelines basically given to it by the teachers union. And you go, well, this isn't right. That's not science. And so you start writing letters to the CDC, and of course they don't respond to you on that as well. So you start certainly understanding that the entire response to COVID is driven by agendas and by political considerations. It's not based on science. As much as Anthony Fauci said he was science, it was not based on science. And again, you just get more and more suspicious when you realize that people are dying, that they didn't have to die. When you see doctors being vilified, when you see them being censored, when people are being made an example of so that other people toe the line and just follow exactly what Fauci and the Birxes of the world tell them to do. It was a travesty.
Well, I can tell you, I, for one, and Drew knows this well, I was absolutely vilified. I was kicked off social media very early on in this debacle. I have defended myself against 7 formal complaints against my medical license over these past 3 years. It's debilitating and exhausting. They get away with it. And the idea that you as a sitting senator cannot write a letter requesting something from one of our federal agencies and expect a response. The fact that they essentially dismissed you or ignored you when you were asking
That's
very
crazy to me.
legitimate questions. It's insanity. I mean, how is that
It's
even
insanity.
allowed to happen?
Yeah.
You
that's
as a
what
sitting
it's
senator.
Unfortunately, administration after administration, the people serving in government realize that Congress doesn't really have much authority when it comes to oversight. They all come before our committees during the confirmation process. They raise their hand. They vow to comply with the congressional oversight requests, and then they don't. And about all we can do is hold them in contempt. That's not the easiest thing to get through any chamber. And then once they're held in contempt, you would need a Department of Justice to prosecute them. But as long as the Department of Justice is in control of and it is controlled by the administration making the decisions, they're not going to hold anybody accountable. So, Congress has become pretty toothless when it comes to its oversight responsibility, and that needs to be fixed.
And this
So
is, I
can
guess,
that
a
be fixed?
tangential.
I'm wondering. But I'm wondering, for instance, something as specific as before a public health authority can take away civil liberties of massive numbers of people, they have to come before elected officials or a committee or something. Isn't that a simple fix? Is that going to be impossible to get something like that through?
Well, let's hope not. It's one of the things. Again, we have to find out exactly what happened here, tell the truth about it, so that we can actually move to a real solution. But from my standpoint, part of the problem here is the doctors should be at the very top of the treatment pyramid, and they have the ultimate responsibility, the Hippocratic Oath, to the patient. But right now, doctors are being crushed at the bottom. All the bureaucrats, the big pharma is just crushing them at the very bottom of that treatment pyramid. They're practicing protocols,
100%.
which makes an awful lot of sense in most cases, but every human being is different. Doctors have to have the ultimate responsibility, but right now they don't.
Is there any,
agreed.
Congress is, controls the purse strings. Are there financial levers that can be applied to groups like the CDC and the FDA to make them responsive to your very legitimate requests for information?
Well, unfortunately, the appropriation process is completely broken. You just witnessed that at the end of this year. We're 3 months into the fiscal year. We haven't brought up one appropriation bill, which would be the point in time where you could maybe use the purse to discipline the administration, but instead we pass a massive, multiple thousand-page omnibus bill. Nobody has time to read it. They don't know what's in it, other than the people who've actually written it behind closed doors. So, the dysfunction here in Washington D.C. is profound, and so all these levers that should be available to us to exert the people's control over the process, it's just not available. We've just over the decades granted so much authority to the executive, and presidents and the bureaucrats are happy to take that authority.
So here you are, you're in Washington, and you already, as a non-physician, were clearly aware of the failure on the early treatment side, and the fact that available treatments were being suppressed. You very quickly were bringing attention to the fact that there was intrusion of third parties into the decision-making on public health matters that should never have been involved in this, including groups like the teachers' unions, who wielded far too much pressure. Then the next thing that I was aware that you were involved in writing letters and asking the tough questions relates to the origin of COVID, which is hand in glove with the entire issue of gain of function research. As I've talked about on this and many other programs, there are very few things that I really agreed with President Obama about. But the moratorium that was placed in 2014 on gain of function research is one thing that I absolutely supported, because it is very, very dangerous and it is fraught with potential disaster. Talk, if you would, about that issue, how you became alerted to the issue about gain of function and to potential questions about the origin of the virus and where you took that.
Well, because of my advocacy for early treatment, I did get connected to a global network of eminently qualified doctors and medical researchers by the summer of 2020. And so within that group, there were computational biologists and other just experts that took a look at the coronavirus and said there's no way this thing sprung from nature. Whether it's the furon cleavage site, now you've got this super antigen section here that is very close to a bioweapon and part of the spike protein as well. So these people were talking about this very early on. Plus, I was also talking to individuals that really did understand what this vaccine was going to be like. They were beside themselves. They couldn't even believe what was being proposed here, to have a gene therapy produced that would actually have the body produce its own toxin. They just couldn't believe it. So I was kind of put on. I was already given the warning to be a little concerned about this and exercise caution in terms of pushing this on everybody. So again, I was fortunate enough to be talking to just incredibly knowledgeable people with a completely different opinion on the vaccine and also our approach to how to handle the pandemic. But also when it came to what the origin of this thing was, they completely dismissed the natural origin. They said this had to be man-made. So that raised my suspicions of why that was such a conspiracy theory when it seemed to be the most logical explanation for this thing.
Well, I definitely want to spend quite a bit of time talking about the vaccines and where we're going with those and the mounting evidence of ill effects from them. But before I let go of this gain of function issue, I think it's really important. Both you and Rand Paul hammered Anthony Fauci on this issue, and really, I think from my perspective, this meets every definition of gain of function research. And I believe that Anthony Fauci perjured himself, not once, not twice, but multiple times with regard to his involvement in this and the fact that U.S. taxpayer dollars were used to fund this research, whether they were shuttled through EcoHealth Alliance or not. It's U.S. taxpayer dollars were used for this. Where is that investigation going? Where can we expect to see? Will there ever be accountability for this?
Well, I hope so. The problem is the initial investigation was mishandled so badly. And the Chinese destroyed all kinds of evidence. I'm not sure you're ever going to have the smoking gun piece of evidence here, but I don't think you need it. It's pretty obvious that we were funding, whether you define it as gain of function or not, dangerous research that needs to be tightly controlled. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that when you start sharing that kind of dangerous research with anybody in China, you're sharing it with the Chinese military, and we shouldn't be doing that. If you're going to do this, and there could be some rationale for conducting this research in the age of the CRISPR technology, when people can splice together genes and create these types of things, you ought to be prepared for what happens if somebody uses a bioweapon. So again, I don't fault our Defense Department for doing research. What I fault the people for is not tightly controlling it. And so we need to understand exactly what happened. We need to tightly control any type of this research whatsoever. We shouldn't be shopping this out to universities and then shop it out to some of their colleagues all over the seas. This needs to be tightly controlled.
And do you think?
I have a question,
do you think that
Kelly,
these investigations?
if I could interrupt.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's the China keeps coming up. China's role in this pandemic, continues to loom large. Whether it is how they hoodwinked our scientists to believe in their lockdown procedures as some sort of scientific measure that had absolute certainty of effectiveness, or how they obfuscated around the origin of the virus. So much of this revolves around China, and yet it rarely gets into the conversation except at the periphery. Is the government, are you guys bringing it into the center, or is it so dangerous and volatile to put them there that people are afraid to do so?
No, I don't think so. I think we just don't have the absolute hard evidence. I mean, my assumption is, based on what I've read, it's pretty obvious that this thing probably was created in the Wuhan lab. Whether it was, I doubt it was purposely released. I think it's probably accidentally released. I think China knew about that far earlier than they've ever admitted. And I think where the real culpability lies, and where I think it's pretty provable, is the fact they shut down flights out of Wuhan into China, but they allowed those flights to go on for probably months into the rest of the world, so that they realized they had a problem, that they had probably created a problem. And they wanted to make darn good and sure that they weren't the only ones experiencing the problem. They wanted to make sure that every other economy in the world would be hit as hard as they were as well. So I think that's, from my standpoint, pretty obvious. But
thus
I don't have
the lockdown too. I mean, to convince people to lock down is part of that same kind of phenomenology, it seems to me. And that was the most bizarre thing of all. The thus saith the Lord when it comes to Chinese, with the Chinese policy of lockdown. That was the wildest thing. Kelly, you and I talked about that way back, and it's just extraordinary.
Right. Well, and
again,
there's a reason
they're in a global competition that they want to win. And one way that you win a competition is you kneecap your competitor. And they knew they were going to be kneecapped with this pandemic. They want to make sure everybody else was as well.
Yeah. Do you think there will be any accountability, at least in the United States, with regard to the people? Clearly, there are people who knew about this research that was being done, and certainly Anthony Fauci is one of them, but he's certainly not the only one. Ralph Barrack at my alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill, and Peter Daszak from EcoHealth Alliance. There are lots of people whose fingerprints are on this. The question is, where will Congress, do you see Congress having the teeth to do anything about it? Or is this simply, are we just moving past?
I think eventually we'll get enough of the truth out where it's going to be pretty obvious exactly what happened here. Through FOIA requests, we have Anthony Fauci's emails. Now, FOIA, those emails can be heavily redacted. I was grateful that the chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee, John Ossoff, cooperated with me. So we requested those emails in an unredacted form. Now, the agencies didn't really cooperate with us. What they allowed us to do is we identified 400 of the 4,000 pages we wanted to look at. And so the agency, HHS, allowed us to review 50 pages at a time in a reading room, unredacted. 50 pages at a time. Now, it's taken us over a year. We're down to the last 50 pages. They won't let us look at those. So you pretty well know where the incriminating evidence is. Right. And now the House is in Republican hands, and I couldn't get John to issue subpoenas. We were getting enough cooperation. That's what the agencies do. They slow walk you. They comply just enough. Hopefully they can run out the clock so that you never really get to the bottom of it. But now you have House with subpoena power. Those should be the first 50 pages of documents I would subpoena, and maybe we'll get some more information there. But again, I think the House will be pretty aggressive here, and hopefully we'll be able to uncover and expose the truth.
From your lips to God's ears. Unfortunately, one of the problems is, and this happens not infrequently, but my area of expertise is crisis management. And when you have the goalpost constantly moving, you're on to the next crisis. Now we're into the issue of vaccines. So you forget about all of the atrocities that happen with lack of early treatment, and you forget about, that whole gain of function thing and the whole origin thing. We'll get to that. But it's hard to, because you're dealing with today's crisis, rightly so. I mean, this is how you have to deal with what's in front of you. But hopefully we will circle back at some point and get answers to those other things. Otherwise, we are doomed. This is going to happen again. So let's move on to the issue with the vaccines now. You, as much as anyone, are aware of the mounting evidence of ill effects, and frankly, the breaches of standard protocols, standard regulatory procedures from the FDA, from the vaccine manufacturers, and again, obfuscation with regard to willingness to actually make the data available. VAERS is the CDC's own system. You've been demanding answers again for over a year now. It kind of bring us up to speed where you are in that investigation.
Sure. Again, because I was talking to people that actually developed vaccines, and then they were highly concerned about what Pfizer and Moderna were doing here with this, gene therapy. Gerd Vandenbosch, warning against mass vaccination in the midst of a pandemic, driving variants. I had my antenna up, so I was aware of the VAERS system, and so I started tracking it very early on. And I'd say about March, April of 2021, we're already seeing over 4,000 deaths on the VAERS system. And back then, it was over 40% of those deaths were occurring on days 0, 1, or 2. And we actually had a group of Republican senators meeting with Francis Collins. Everybody else was basically patting themselves on the back. And, didn't we do a great job developing tests and distributing? And of course, I'm the skunk in the room. And so, well, Dr. Collins, are you paying attention to what's happening on VAERS? And he immediately went right to the J&J. He said, well, Senator, we've only determined that 6 deaths were caused by the vaccine. Those are the J&J, and we stopped it. And I said, well, what about the other more than 4,000? And he just looked at me and said, well, Senator, people die. First of all, I could not even believe how what a brazen answer that was. But again, 40% of those deaths were occurring on days 0, 1, or 2. And I realized VAERS doesn't prove causation. But I also realized VAERS, one of the problems is it dramatically understates the number of adverse events. Right. So I start publishing my chart on a weekly basis. It's being censored by social media. But I mean, today, the most recent chart, we have over 34,000 deaths reported in the VAERS system, over 1.5 million adverse events. Today, about 25.5% of those deaths are occurring on days 0, 1, or 2. Now, again, I know it's not proof, but that sure would concern me. It does concern me. And I can't believe how the CDC, the FDA, the NIH have not exhibited the same concern over what their own safety surveillance system is showing. Then you have VSafe, a system set up specifically to track this. Now, it wasn't set up to really track these serious complications. They're talking about, days missed from work or visiting the hospital. But those numbers are shocking. 25% of people report on that VSafe system, about 10 million people sampled, that they experienced enough problem where they had to take off a day of work. And I think 8% had to, visit
the hospital.
A hospital, seek medical care.
Yep.
And they're blowing it off. And so I'm writing oversight letter after oversight letter. I'm getting no response. We did through a FOIA request, found out that one of my oversight letters, this was all having to do with the granting of the approval for Comirnaty. They got it. They were concerned about it. They wanted to respond to it. And this is Peter Marks in the email chain saying, well, we've got a ready-made response. This was within 2 hours of them initiating this email chain over my letter. That's how unseriously they take a very unique oversight letter for me, all kinds of detail in it, and they've already got a ready-made response that they blew out to me. And again, it's just cavalier.
Remind me, Senator, when was that first conversation you had with Francis Collins, where you were pointing out the 4,000 deaths that had been reported to VAERS? When was that?
I believe that was April of 2021.
So think about that. If back in April of 2021, you were already bringing this to their attention, yet they're out there saying safe and effective, safe and effective. If you go back to 1976, to the swine flu vaccine program, that vaccine was pulled from the market after there were 50 associated possible deaths. 50. Here you are pointing out 4,000, and they're, saying, shrugging their shoulders and saying, people die. It's unconscionable.
They just pulled an eye drop after one death.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
because I've been out there, okay, I'm kind of the tip of the spear on this thing. I just get all this information. I get all these just heart-wrenching stories. I've hugged the vaccine injured. I've hugged the father of his only child, his 16-year-old son. You can't ignore this. I mean, you hear the stories. To me, it's obvious these tragedies have been caused by the vaccine.
Right.
And I did a kind of a event with Jason Whitlock, and we had Bobby Kennedy there. We had a bunch of other people there, and what all of us have in common is our eyes have been opened. We've seen the truth on this, and we can't rest until other people's eyes are open. And I'm sure Dr. Victory, Dr. Drew, you're probably the same way. It's like what aren't people seeing? How is the truth being so suppressed?
Yeah.
Well, that is
Yeah.
truly
Yeah,
that
it's
is
so
truly the
frustrating.
terrifying thing.
It yeah, and it's what Kelly and I struggle with constantly. To me, a really sort of, there's you can put a really fine point on where the obscurantism is, or the obfuscation, which is just as simple a question as what took Damar Hamlin down. Why can't we know what that was? Is there what is so? People say, "Oh, he has insurance. He doesn't want his insurance to know." You don't think his insurance know that he dropped dead on the field? They will demand an explanation for what happened, and they will get it. Why can't the rest of us know? It's not like he had some embarrassing condition, or that the actual underlying causation is somehow worthy of the HIPAA protection. I mean, he's entitled to HIPAA protection, but you would think he'd want to share it with his peers so the NFL can accommodate any potential risk of other players. And it's complete zero.
Well, so one thing I've learned, and I got introduced to the vaccine injured through Ken Ruckers, who is a Green Bay Packer Hall of Famer. His wife, Cheryl, was vaccine injured. So that's how I got connected. Well, after the incident with the Buffalo Bill player, we immediately went to this group of sports individuals. Dave Stockton's one of them. We've got somebody from the hockey league, and we went to their players association. We've got a couple, crack cardiologists to offer a way of potentially diagnosing this. They're not interested. The players unions aren't interested. They don't want to know. The players don't want to know. So they don't want to give up a $3, $4, $10, $15 million career. And so, people are putting their heads in the sand from that standpoint, but this isn't normal. I mean, we hear almost daily of a young famous person, whether it's a sports hero or somebody in entertainment, just dying suddenly. And they never ask the obvious question is, did they just get a booster? Are they vaccinated? How many doses have they gotten? They refuse to
When did they have
question.
COVID? Let's take aim at COVID as a potential cause. Let's at least answer that question. Or COVID plus booster.
It's just coincidental. There's an organization called Good Sciencing, and they've been keeping track of all the collapses and deaths from athletes. And they're up to, I think, last time I looked, 1,648 collapses. 1,100 of those result in deaths. And that compares to studies that the International Olympic Committee has conducted, where it's maybe 20 to 60 per year. We're up to 600 per year. Again, this isn't normal, but it's completely being ignored. It's being suppressed. It's being censored as much as possible.
Yeah, the International Olympic Committee, that study over 38 years found an average of just under 29 deaths per year, sudden cardiac deaths in elite athletes. And although I will argue, I agree with you. I suppose if a NFL player doesn't want to know, that's his prerogative. I'll tell you whose prerogative it's not. If you're an airline pilot, or if you're a bus driver, or if you're somebody, okay, there are a lot of people out there. The data on airline pilots, we had Dr. Teresa Long as a guest some months ago, and you're well aware, you've had her, she testified in front of your committee on the unbelievable data out of the Defense Military Epidemiology Database, DMED, that showed massive increases in everything from infertility to neurologic complications and certainly cardiac events. She reports that huge numbers of pilots in the military and one must assume that the FAA is aware of this. Is anyone addressing this potentially disastrous situation with airline pilots?
Well, it doesn't surprise you. I've written oversight letters. I just spoke with Bob Snow a couple of weeks ago, and I'd written a pretty detailed letter to the FAA as well. Found out that their chief medical officer never even contacted Bob Snow, nor did anybody at American Airlines. And Bob Snow is an American airline pilot who had a cardiac arrest, not a heart attack, a cardiac arrest 6 minutes after landing his jet. Now he has no heart damage. He didn't have, blocked arteries. His heart just stopped. And of course, that's concerned with myocarditis, screws up the rhythm, the electrical conduct. Again, you're the doctors, okay? And with a burst of adrenaline or something like that, apparently that could stop a heart. But, again, I'm not a doctor. I don't fully understand these things. But as a layman, I can understand them. But we're not asking the questions. We're not exploring it. There's a complete lack of curiosity. The agencies, the heads of the agencies, the heads of the airline, they just don't want to know because they force these vaccines on everybody. And that's part of the problem. Nobody wants to admit they're wrong. Members of Congress don't want to admit they're wrong, pushing these things on their constituents. Doctors don't want to admit they may have been wrong. They really, strongly recommending a vaccine that might have killed somebody or resulted in a lifelong disability. Nobody wants to admit they're wrong. And so they're all burying their heads in the sand.
No, and Senator, you're right. This isn't just conjecture. We know, hang on for a second, Drew, because we know we've had Ryan Cole on. Ryan Cole is a good friend of the show as well. And we know that not only are we seeing these events clinically, but he is able to prove from a pathological standpoint, from a slide, from a micro level, exactly why we're seeing them. We know darn well that this is a result of the vaccines. The proof is irrefutable. The cells do not lie. The slides do not lie. And speaking of Peter Marks at the FDA, he came out and acknowledged openly that children have a 5 times higher risk of developing myocarditis if they get these, quote, vaccines than if not. Yet we are still allowing them to be pushed on children. This is a tremendous breach of standard protocols. So to get to where Drew typically, takes these discussions, which is why, how do we all of a sudden leap to this absolute breach of standard protocol in the sciences, in the FDA, our previously trusted institutions like the CDC? We have forever undermined public confidence in these, but how did we get there with lack of oversight?
Well, again, we created a state of fear, declared an emergency, and then there's a fair amount of people doing research in terms of the laws that have been put in place over the decades that allowed bureaucrats to take advantage of that state of emergency, probably run these vaccines through the Department of Defense so they could bypass all the required studies. The FDA sat by and just kind of looked the other way. I'm a business guy. I'm not real fond of attorneys. Maybe as doctors, you're maybe not too nuts about them either. But in this case, I'm really starting to see the value of attorneys and lawsuits and FOIA requests. I mean, Aaron Series done great work, forcing Pfizer now to turn over, the results of its trials in 90,000 page tranches. We're not going to get the good stuff till the final tranche. That is, if they don't destroy it. Again, I don't necessarily trust these people to be completely transparent. But again, what we're finding is it is shocking. It is jaw-dropping. The biodistribution that they knew full well. I mean, there's so much that they did know that they should have known. I remember talking to one of my experts who says, Ron, I was educated with these folks. I know what they know. I know they're lying to us. I know they know they're lying to us. But they're keeping it pretty well hidden.
No, and so you are rightly putting out the next, addressing the next crisis. Right now we're on to vaccine injuries, but we have this mounting sea of issues, and I can't let go of the refusal to allow us to do early treatments, and the fact that they put the kibosh on those things. And we lived through, 2 years of therapeutic nihilism. Then we went on to, the stuff about the masks and the lockdowns. And now we're on to vaccines, and we had gain of function issues, and like all of this. There is so much to unpack. And if were it not for you, who are single-handedly, if I look at your list of letters you have written, demands you have made, I am angry. I am angry for you. I'm angry for Congress. I'm angry that we have agencies that think they can simply thumb their noses at a sitting senator and not respond.
Yes,
We
that's
really
that's
have,
shocking to me. It's disgusting. It's incredible.
yeah.
Well,
I mean,
every letter that goes unanswered just increases my level of suspicion. So I just keep.
Yeah.
I'm reasonably tenacious, so I just keep digging. I'm not going to give up. And honestly, probably the primary reason is a better way to put it of me running again, because the dysfunction in Washington D.C. is profound. I just wanted to walk away, but having been contacted by the vaccine injured, having been involved, realizing there is no other advocate here in Washington D.C. for the vaccine injured, I couldn't turn my back on him. And so that's why I decided to run for re-election. And I'm going to slog it out for another 6 years here. I've got to get to the bottom of this. We have to get to the bottom of this. This is unacceptable.
So much of what has happened to me has a kind of a hysterical basis to it, a psychological basis to it. And I'm wondering if some of this vaccine, the ignoring of the vaccine, has also some. You've mentioned the things that are certainly sources of motivation, but I'm wondering if psychologically, if people are just adjusting in their head and going, well, this was so horrible. This was such a horrible pandemic that I'm just willing to accept a lot of death and destruction from this vaccine if it gets us out of it. And I don't want to address that potential on one side. And then the other side, I wonder is, does somebody know something about COVID and its adverse effects that they're not telling us? I always wonder, is there something they keep sort of tilting towards that and talking about myocardial effects and neurological effects, but it never really bears fruit. So on one hand, I wonder if we're getting information hidden about COVID. The other, I'm wondering how we address the psychology of people being willing to accept the unacceptable in the face of a pandemic that was not as bad as their emotional memory tells them it was.
Again, I go back to the basic human tendency that you don't want to admit you were wrong. So people don't want to admit that they were wrong to listen to the Anthony Fauci's of the world, to be so freaked out by this thing. 70% of Americans have got the vaccine. Listen, I tread very lightly. I don't tell people all the things I know. I just don't, because I don't want to scare them. People don't want to, even think about, maybe I made a bad decision here. Maybe I should have exercised a little bit more caution. Maybe I shouldn't have, got the jabs and 2 or 3 booster doses. They don't want to believe that maybe they've got a ticking time bomb. I hope that's not the case. I've got a couple of kids who got vaccinated. They wouldn't listen to me. They believe Fauci. I realize I'm not a doctor. So I'm hoping and praying that all my concerns don't come to fruition. That, the vaccine injuries really are, it's kind of the luck of the draw, and it's very specific. Again, I'm not a doctor, but again, I've just talked to so many. I've got real serious concerns here.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you can do. Drew and I can continue to highlight this, to bring voices to the lay people, to have these open forums, and we do it regularly. It's been critically important. I think we've had many folks who have been censored and silenced, scientific people who have the data. They know where the bodies are buried, and people like yourself who have been tireless in Washington. You can do the piece that certainly that I can't in Washington, and so I appreciate you taking the slings and arrows in Congress on our behalf. Please don't stop. Please keep tipping the windmills, turn over these rocks, get these, expose this stuff, because if you don't, I don't know who can.
Well, listen, all I'm looking for is the truth. I'm
Right.
like everybody else. I'm hoping my worst fears aren't realized, but we have to get to the bottom of this. We have to expose the truth, and I have to believe the truth has its own power.
And we have to find some way to get the media to report this honestly and thoroughly without going immediately dismissing anything that runs counter to what they've been fed. I don't know how you get there. I mean, except by letting them lose their audience and offering on digital platforms like this alternative sort of places for people to come for information.
They need to talk to the vaccine injured. And I've advised the vaccine injured, get organized, insist that you meet with your members of Congress, go to them, tell them your stories. One thing we haven't talked about is just the travesties that occurred within hospitals. The other thing I hear, just countless stories that they're heart-wrenching. Family members going and begging hospitals, just try it. Try this. Try these drugs. We're begging you, and they simply won't. There's Dr. Urso posted a tweet today of a daughter just screaming in the camera. Just the anger is just palpable. We actually need more people to tell those types of stories, and maybe it'll awaken members of the media, because we do need the media to be honest about this and have their eyes open as well.
One of the ironies, the great ironies I will tell you about these drugs, Senator, is that had hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and budesonide not been FDA approved, all of them would have been available to patients under the Right to Try Act, Donald Trump's Right to Try Act. It was the fact that they're FDA approved, the fact that they're so darn safe, the fact that we have decades of safety data behind them that made them not available. Think of the irony of that.
Well, I normally don't do this, but you have to understand I'm the champion of that bill. That's my bill. That was after meeting a woman with ALS, and having met with the Goldwater Institute, I decided to champion that, and I shepherd that through Congress. So that what I'm got right now is right to treat, which should not be necessary, but we need to obviously enact a law so the doctors can utilize their full off-label prescription rights and on-label. That's part of the trap here. There are all kinds of drugs that were used that could be used on-label to treat the inflammation, the clotting. They weren't even allowed to treat it. In my second opinion event, we had Dr. Paul Merrick, just an eminently qualified critical care specialist, tell his story about how the hospital took away his ability to use the drugs he was using to save patients. His death rate was half that of the other people in the ICU, and they took away the drugs, but they left him with his patients. And he testifies, so his hands were tied, and all he could do is sit by and watch his patients die.
Right.
Again, I've heard countless stories from family members that the world needs to hear. They need to understand what happened, and we need to fix it so that never happens again.
Kelly, Senator Johnson's idea is a very good one. And Susan, I'll throw this to you, but we should talk to some of the people that Senator Johnson has heard from and put them on these programs, get 3 or 4 of them in across an hour and let them tell their stories so people can hear that. I think it's a good idea.
I agree. The vaccine injured need a voice.
Yeah. Part of the problem,
Senator Johnson, Go ahead.
Let me just say,
Senator Johnson,
the vaccine injured, the ones that suffer the neurological, unless they're paralyzed, they look too healthy. And so and a lot of the neurological injuries are with women. And so they go into their doctors because the CDC hasn't acknowledged vaccine injuries, and the doctors just think it's all in their head. So it's even
a very
worse.
Close friend of mine.
So isolated. It's horrible for them.
I know. We've been working with long hauler researchers since the beginning of this thing, and they have a whole cohort of these folks. And a dear friend of mine got a vaccine injury. He was sick for a year, couldn't walk a block, and he's willing to be interviewed. So there's a lot of people willing to step up and tell the story. But Senator Johnson, we're going to wrap this up right here. We so appreciate, including me. I was vaccine injured. There's a picture of my raccoon eye that I woke up with after the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a sign of a consumptive coagulopathy, which is what was killing people with the J&J vaccine. So here you go. And I knew I'd have a terrible reaction because I react to all vaccines.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Thank you both for what you're doing. Dr. Drew, thank you for opening your mind. I'm talking to Dr. Kelly. I know you've not necessarily been agreeing all the time, but you're willing to listen, and that's what we need. Science is about being skeptical.
Absolutely. One thing this virus has taught me is, hubris and certainty is the enemy, and openness and thoughtfulness and critical reason is the solution. And so I'm evolving my thinking, as we're going along here, and I've learned something from everybody, including yourself. And we very much appreciate you being here and fighting the fight you're fighting. And whatever we can do to support you, I hope you'll let us know.
Well, thank you. Have a great day. Stay well.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you,
again
Senator
for being
Ron Johnson.
with us.
And then Kelly, Jessica Rose and Brooke coming in next couple of weeks.
Yes, we've got Dr. Jessica Rose next Wednesday, the 15th, and then the following Wednesday, the 22nd, Brooke Jackson, who's a whistleblower from Pfizer, with some great stuff to report. So should be two terrific shows coming up.
Great. Kelly, thank you so much. And we will see you. Caleb or Susan, anything from your guys' standpoint? You're all good?
Duncan Trussell on Valentine's
Duncan
Day.
Trussell on Valentine's Day and Naomi Wolf tomorrow. So,
and then somebody on Friday,
right.
the woman from England.
Yes, I'm speaking to a woman who runs one of these organizations that got the, I'm blanking on her name right now, but she was the one that really got the UK to stop giving vaccines to kids. They've taken that mandate away.
Well, give my regards to Naomi. Naomi Wolf has, my regards to Naomi. She's got great information about the impact on women and fertility with these shots. So, big deal.
And I was a little dismissive. Last time I talked to her. About,
You didn't.
And
you didn't like her ideas.
Well, some of it was like, but now I need to fall on my sword full on. So I will do so.
And she's still taking heat. We also have to have the Fuck It Bucket show with Kelly at the end of the month. We need to figure out who that's from.
Absolutely. I've got some good.
Bucket.
Yeah, I have lots of other good guests in the queue here. Some really good folks, physicians and non-physicians who, again, know where the bodies are buried. So good people to have.
Wildness. All right, Kelly, we'll see you next Wednesday. And everyone else, we will see you tomorrow at 3:00 Pacific time and 11. Let me double check this. It's either 11 or 12.
11 on Friday.
11 a.m. on Friday, Pacific time. These are all Pacific times, of course. So we'll see you tomorrow at 3 with Naomi Wolf. Ask Dr. Drew is produced by Caleb Nation and Susan Pinsky. As a reminder, the discussions here are not a substitute for medical care, diagnosis, or treatment. This show is intended for educational and informational purposes only. I am a licensed physician, but I am not a replacement for your personal doctor, and I am not practicing medicine here. Always remember that our understanding of medicine and science is constantly evolving. Though my opinion is based on the information that is available to me today, some of the contents of this show could be outdated in the future. Be sure to check with trusted resources in case any of the information has been updated since this was published. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, don't call me, call 911. If you're feeling hopeless or suicidal, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255. You can find more of my recommended organizations and helpful resources at drdrew.com/help. I'll make it easy on you. I have anxiety disorder. I've had generalized anxiety my whole life. There's different flavors of anxiety. There are people that anxiety leads into depression.
Yeah.
And there are people that depression creates anxiety. It's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah.
And in my world, the people that have more of the depression that goes towards anxiety tends to have more of an OCD flavor.
Okay.
And so I have lots of obsessive compulsive stuff that these gentlemen will tell you all about, give me shit about on a regular basis.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting.
But, I look at all of these qualities that our brains have that we inherit through evolutionary biology as having assets and liability.
Sure.
Right. So in medicine, having OCD is extremely helpful because you check and you double check and you doubt yourself and you even when you're sure you checked, you check it again.
Wow.
And that was very, very helpful for many, many years. And there's no effort to that. You just do it because that's your anxiety makes you do it. But I went into therapy when I was like about 33 because the anxiety was driving my wife crazy.
I never knew this side of you or about this side. And you're almost like you're like Nurse Jackie. It's like you're the healthcare person, but you have all these things going on.
There's a reason that people that work in recovery are often in recovery.
Yeah,
it helps you.
Wow.
And the other thing, because I had bad enough anxiety that I really needed to clean things up, it I became an instrument that I could really use for other people. It was very helpful.
I feel like it's almost like with anxiety, it's like being in AA, where it's like you could be a good sponsor to somebody, but it doesn't mean you're not an alcoholic and don't have your own struggle going.
Correct.
You know, that you need somebody to talk to you about.
Oh, yeah. But before you can be a sponsor, you have to have your shit together. You have to be in the program a while.
Shit together.
So, I mean,
but I dial out the
but
advice.
still an alcoholic. They're still an alcoholic.
Yeah.
But they've worked on their shit and done the process. So